Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and welcome. I'm Tiffany Pewitt. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Diversity and Civic Life. And I'm here today with our program coordinator, Rimsha Saeed, our oral historian, Eleonora Aneda, and our archive coordinator, Van Wagner, as well as our Director of Operations, Sadia Tirmizi. We're pleased to be co-hosting this event with I-AMM, Interconnecting Arabs, Muslims, and Middle Eastern Americans. And we're joined by I-AMM's Executive Director, Banafsheh Madinejad, Roy Casagranda, the podcast co-host, and other podcast co-host Ramesh Nadeem, and Trinity University Professor of Education, Habiba Noor. Today is the 20th anniversary of the attacks of September 11th, 2001, and this day has been seared into the collective hearts and imaginations of many of us across the country. As we grieve and reflect on the thousands of lives lost on 9/11, we know that the tragedy and the losses aren't confined to that day. The events of 9/11 have served as a catalyst for a succession of foreign and domestic policy decisions, political and cultural shifts, and structural changes. It's ushered in an era shaped by xenophobia, surveillance, and militarism, as well as coalition building, grassroots organizing, interfaith dialogue, and anti-racist organizing. At IDCL, we've launched a new oral history collection called 9/11, 20 Years Later, to gather the stories of how this event has shaped us over the past 20 years, especially those of us in Texas, who are thousands of miles away from ground zero. Today, we want to share some brief clips of some of the first interviews in this collection. And our speakers will talk about the complexities of 9/11 and the stories that are often not told or left out of the larger narrative. So we'll be playing some clips, and then our speakers will respond to these clips and offer remarks. And then at the end, after we've done all of this, we'll have some time for Q&A. And if you have questions or comments that you would like to ask or share, we ask that you put them in the chat. Since there are many of us here today, we're just going to read the questions out from the chat rather than having people ask them individually for the sake of time. And we expect this event to go until 3:30. And also to note as well, this event is recorded and we will later post this on our Facebook page. Okay, I am going to turn things over now to Rimsha Saeed.
Hi guys, I'm Rimsha. I'm the program coordinator with IDCL. Thanks everyone for joining. And thanks Tiffany for giving some context about the 9/11 collection. I wanted to expand on that a little bit from the perspective of someone who's Muslim and grew up in Texas after 9/11. And for as long as I can remember, I've only ever seen 9/11 being commemorated by talking about nationalism and patriotism. But 20 years later, the impact of structural Islamophobia and the war on terror is still present for many Brown and Muslim people. And I think that the necessity of this collection is to hear stories that are often neglected in the way media and schools have historicized 9/11. And I think through this collection, we've been intentional in allowing the stories of Brown people, Muslims, Sikhs, and immigrants to really speak for themselves and start to give some more insight into the way 9/11 has affected their sense of belonging, their identity, their livelihoods, and the longstanding effects of their communities, both in Texas and in their homelands. So we have some clips today with people talking about their classroom experiences that are very similar to my own. And for context, I was 5 years old when 9/11 happened. And in elementary school is the first time that I started to learn about 9/11. And I was basically shown a documentary style video with clips of the towers falling, and then it would switch to clips of Muslims praying at the mosque, as well as women in hijabs and just Muslim communities existing, which was very confusing for me. I heard phrases like radical Islam and Muslim terrorists and being used in those conversations. And in my head, I was thinking, okay, I know what Muslim means because I am one, but I don't really know what else is going on here. And then immediately after that is when I started to receive like weird looks and comments from people in my class. And this, of course, just got worse through middle school and even high school. And then when I told my parents about what was going on, we had all kind of collectively decided to stop telling people at school that we were Muslim for our own safety. And so what I really wanted to emphasize today is that learning about 9/11 is actually mandatory in most Texas K through 12 school curriculums, starting as early as 3rd grade, I believe. But there are many ways in which these academic standards have completely failed their Muslim students and have even reinforced anti-Muslim sentiment at times. And then in Texas academic standards, they even use polarizing language like radical Islamic fundamentalism, which really just associates terrorism with Muslim countries. And from my own observations, as well as from the interviews that I've conducted for this collection, I think it's evident that the way 9/11 is institutionalized in the classroom paints the US as a victim and Muslims as villains. And to a classroom full of young and very impressionable people that can start to plant certain stereotypes that lead to othering their brown or Muslim peers. And on the flip side, it can have profound effects on people's ability to navigate their sense of belonging in a country that already makes it very difficult to do so. So that being said, we'll hear some clips today with some similar sentiments. And in this first clip with Manahil Bilal, who's actually a good friend of mine, she grew up in the suburbs of Spring, Texas, after immigrating to the US from Pakistan. And in this clip, she's speaking to a specific encounter she had with one of the many teachers who reinforced some misinformation. So without further ado, let's hear from Manahil.
In 7th grade, I think is when they, like I think 2011 is when they killed Osama bin Laden. And I would get, those comments, oh, sorry, your uncle died, from the white kids. Like, yeah, it was really annoying, but then at some point I was just like, okay, I just gotta get through these next couple of days and I'll be fine. But then after that kind of became something that I would kind of just expect every year. My cousin, they all look super Pakistani and like super foreign. And so this poor guy, he would get it so much harder because his friends would make fun of it so much. And they would say really, really mean things about our religion and things like that. And but the one thing that I remembered is I remember I was giving some presentation in 8th grade, and I think I was talking about how my religion, like, we love and accept everybody, and I raised my hand once and I was like, I don't really understand why, like, my people were getting targeted the most out of everyone else. Like, I understand that the people who did it were part of the Muslim or considered themselves to be part of the Muslim faith, but I understand why, we got the butt end of it. And then my teacher, this was in history, and she was like, oh, so, well, the reason why is because when you tune in to watch the news, you would see people in Pakistan, people in different Islamic countries like yours, they would be clapping their hands when they would be talking about 9/11. So that's why it is the way it is. And I was kind of just like, at that point, I wasn't as educated about 9/11 at all. So that's just something that I remember, because now when I look back at it, I should have said something.
So the next clip that we'll be listening to is from Faiza Susan, an Ahmadi Muslim who was raised in North Texas. and you'll hear her speak about some discrimination she faced in middle school as well, and the way that her mosque reacted to the rise in anti-Muslim sentiment at that time.
9/11 happened when I was in 6th grade, and it didn't really hit me up until maybe 8th grade. 8th grade over here, it's sort of like the starting point before high school. So 8th grade, that's when I'd have people here in Wiley call me stand N-word. They would call that to me straight to my face, and at that point, I never heard that word. And someone had to explain to me that's what they used to call Muslims in a very derogatory way. So that was the point where it really hit me like, wow, there are people that would hate me just because I am Muslim. And, you know, the way my mosque approached the hatred towards Muslims at that point, they were saying you have to be, quote unquote, the best example of being a Muslim. So I tried so hard to be nice, to ingratiate myself and, you know, not try to talk about my religion so much, but try to put a good foot forward. And then going to college and then grad school and then just having to learn more about the world and learn more about my faith per se, I was just like, okay, this is my faith. This is what it really is. I don't have to always be ingratiating myself or be ashamed of who I am. You know, this is who I am. I shouldn't be hiding that.
Hello everyone. Thank you all for being here and be remembering 9/11 with us today. It's so nice to see so many people. So my name is Eleonora Nedda. I am the oral historian at IDCL, and I'm going to be presenting the next 4 clips for narrators. So the next 2 clips that you're going to hear will be about Islamophobia and xenophobia. And the first clip, I believe, is from Negena Haidary. I interviewed Negena a few months ago, and she is an Afghan-American Shia Muslim woman. And in this clip, she remembers what happened in her household on the day on 9/11, and also speaks about the impacts of 9/11 on her family.
So on the day of 9/11, everywhere in New York City was a complete mess, and my dad wasn't able to come home that night. And I remember it being one of the scariest moments of my life, listening to my mom's wails in the kitchen as she's like trying to get his phone, not getting anything back from him. And it was a day that shook America as a whole. And often I feel like people don't see the reaction that happened in Muslim households and how people were affected by it. And that's why they were so easily able to like point fingers and put the blame on a group of, I would say, vulnerable group of people. Like, I would say that the Muslim population is a little bit more of a vulnerable group because they don't fight back when other people point fingers at them. So post 9/11 in our neighborhood, my dad came home, thankfully, but that's when all of our neighbors started to harass us, and they would stand outside the house and wouldn't let anybody come out the house. They would throw eggs, they would throw anything that you can think of at the windows, and they would scream profanities when we would step out of the house and walk to the short distance of the car. And it got to the point where they realized they couldn't stop us from leaving, so they just slashed all of the car's tires. And so we were trapped at home for a while. And I just remember that being one of the scariest weeks of my life
Yes, so that was Negena, and I almost want to thank Negena, even if she's not here to hear that. But the next clip that you're going to hear is from Khadeeja Moosa. Khadeeja is a Pakistani-American Muslim woman who grew up in North Texas. And in this clip, she talks about how 9/11 was memorialized and taught in her school and the ways in which this presentation impacted her on a personal level.
And they showed us pictures of, the Twin Towers. And, I think this is when I started connecting that this might be something that's going to affect me, was when they started mentioning the Islamic radicalists and the terrorists. And I was like, wait, is this the same word, Islamic? Like, does this have to do with me? And they showed pictures of Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and they're like, these are the people who took the lives from, these innocent people, the Islamic, terrorists. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what that means, but I definitely recognize one part of that word. I mean, I was like, what, 5? I have no idea what was going on. So then that's obviously what continued for the rest of it. I mean, in North Texas, especially, they're really, strong on, patriotic acts and, Texas pride, US pride. So every single year it was kind of like the same routine, because as I got older, people started asking more questions too, to me. And so they would be like, oh, so are you part of them? I'm like, no, I'm right here. I live down the street. You know me. So, and obviously then more questions about, because they never really knew what Muslims were, I guess, until after 9/11. And the teachers would start pointing me out too. They'd be like, oh, how do you feel? And I'm like, I mean, I don't know. You're kind of pinpointing me like in front of the entire class right now. Obviously, I feel a little uncomfortable, but the response that they want to hear is, I feel really sad about what has happened, and I hope the world can become a better place. And, we do something about these Islamic radicalists. Like, they're looking for a specific answer from you because they choose you to represent. They're like, you are the hijabi, the Muslim in this classroom. Say something so that like the rest of the class can follow this. I remember then in maybe my junior year of high school, the assemblies got a little bit more, grand as you grow up with ROTC and, military and army coming in, to give their, to like mourn with us. I remember this girl came up to me after school and she was like, do you ever feel guilty about what your people did? And I just kind of stood there because I don't even know how to answer that. I'm like, what do you mean by people?
At this point, we're going to be turning it over to our panelists for a bit of discussion between clips.
Hey, everybody. Well, I'm a little re-stimulated here. My heart beats kind of fast. Yeah, I remember when this happened, I was in grad school. That was intense, yes. I was in grad school. I was in an editing room. I was editing a short documentary I was making. And I'm in a dark room and everybody starts screaming. I come outside, there's a TV right there outside of the editing room, and the professor and I were friends. I look at him, he looks at me, and he just says, we're effed. And you more than me. Kind of reflect. I feel like I have to talk about my emotions to calm down a little bit and what happened to me. And I basically stayed home for a week. I was too scared to go out of the house, out of my apartment. Yeah. I have to say that the thing that really stands out to me is the message of, I'm just picking up words, ashamed, after being called sand, N-word, trapped. These are some of the words that I picked up. Muslims don't fight back. That's what I heard. The tires were slashed, eggs were thrown, screaming profanities. And the response to all of that was nothing, silence. Silence and just scurrying away and getting into a car, and then not even doing that once the tires are slashed. Those early days were like that. hiding, silence, a lot of confusion, fear. There was a lot of fear. Yeah, a lot of, I don't know what that means. Khadeeja was talking about, I don't know what that means. Islamic radicalism. I only recognize Islam in there. The rest of it, I don't get. But we couldn't really voice any of that. That's the thing. We could not speak back. So this was a period of silence and just silence. And I'm gonna say one more thing, and I'm sure everybody has a lot more to say about this. Things are very different now. I'll just say that. Just the very fact that Tiffany has created this forum for us to say what we really want to say, what we wanted to say even back then, is huge. So I'm gonna just pass it along.
I can pick up from there. Since also this includes, hi, I'm Habiba. Nice to see you all here. And yes, I would like to second what Banafshe just said, which is that things are very different. I do think that things are different. Yeah, this morning, 9/11, you know, my kids say, Mom, can you tell me your 9/11 story? And they know that I have a story because I was in New York and I was a witness to all of this with my own eyes. Commuting into work that morning, I was a part of, I was downtown in Manhattan, and it was, you know, a day that I and many people in New York City and around the Pentagon that day, we thought that we were going to die on that day. So we thought life is over, and not because we are Muslim, because I'm a Muslim, it's because I'm a person living in this space. And to me, I think, I'm thinking about what was said in the first oral history clip, that, you know, for her, 9/11 became a day of patriotism and nationalism, the commemoration of it. And for me also, having been in New York during that time, there was that moment between the actual attack and the flags coming out. There was that space in between. The flags did not seem like the natural, inevitable consequence to the act. There were decisions that were made. But a lot of us live in that in-between space. And I think that that's what we're trying to expand here, thinking about that space between this act and the nationalism. I mean, the nationalism took over and it continued for the next 20 years, but there's a type of grieving that, especially those of us that witnessed it, whether by screen or whether in our bodies, there's a type of grieving that I think especially for many New Yorkers, many Muslim New Yorkers, is that you're not allowed to grieve in the same way, that there's, along with the grieving comes a kind of responsibility to explain. And I was actually talking to Tiffany about this yesterday, but just this whole compulsion to explain and the responsibility to explain, which I'm hearing in the oral histories, that there's that space where you're realizing that there's this space that you have to enter into, and maybe then you have to explain. They weren't necessarily describing that part, but you feel that this is the move that pushes people towards having to then explain. And then I feel like for my very much a lot of my academic career, and I'm sure for Banafsheh and for Roy and for others, that explaining became a central, felt like an obligation, when in fact it is a response to no longer belonging, right? To explain is almost like a type of trauma response, and to have to renegotiate your belonging. And so to be in that position and to have opportunities to be able to talk about that, it's a good opportunity, but at the same time, it is a dark place, because to do that means you have to renegotiate your being in this space. If anybody has to explain themselves and to have to explain their humanity, that means that your humanity is fundamentally questioned. And what I'm hearing from these young people that were talking about this is that despite the fact that they weren't there, despite the fact that their bodies weren't there, they're hearing this like years after the event. They are put in this very similar position. Right? So this, from the event through, these lives that were born after, there's a continuity of that obligation, which continues through some of these policies in school. If anybody wants to add.
Yes, so I think I'd like to jump in on and follow up on what Habiba was saying. For me, the tragedy of 9/11, as a person living in Texas at the time and not witnessing it directly, is in large measure what Habiba just talked about, which is that we didn't have to go to the flags, that we sort of made a choice, and the choice was to pick nationalism over our humanity. So my experience in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was, for a moment anyway, I allowed myself to have kind of a naive and hopeful expectation for the United States. And part of the reason was the way people were behaving towards one another. So road rage disappeared. People would hold doors open for everybody. Total strangers would talk to you, and they would talk to you in a friendly manner. And Democrats and Republicans were hanging out together. There was this moment where even anti-Black racism felt like it maybe dropped a notch. Instead of it being at 100, it maybe fell to 90. Like there was this almost collective sigh, the sort of the normal raging, road raging, frenetic American life had taken a break for about a week. And the week didn't last. And instead of us heading in the direction of introspection and trying to figure out who we were and why did this happen, we decided that we were going to paint the world in sort of a Star Wars-like paintbrush, where there's a good and there's an evil, there's a dark force, there's a light force. This was an evil act, as opposed to seeing it as an act of war. It became an act of just raw, pure evil. And we wanted to scapegoat somebody. In the immediate aftermath, on the same day of 9/11, 3 people were killed. A Sikh was killed. And of course, Sikhs are from South Asia, which is interesting because not one of the 19 hijackers was. And Sikhs are not Muslim, for the record. A Muslim Pakistani was killed. Again, Pakistan is South Asia, wrong place. And then a Coptic Orthodox Egyptian was killed. For those who don't know, Copts are Christian. And he kept screaming over and over again, "I'm Christian." And of course, his murderers just didn't care. And that was something that became abundantly clear too, also, was all Muslims, all Arabs, all Turks, all Persians, anybody brown from the region, anyone from Morocco to Indonesia was part of this homogenous collective of people. So that even if you were Christian or anything else for that matter, you were Muslim, and it didn't matter. And you were the reason why the world sucked, because you were part of this evil homogenous group. And we used that to catapult nationalism. I think that the number of hair clipper sales in the weeks that followed 9/11 must have been through the roof, must have been record. Like, I bet China couldn't produce them fast enough to send them here. because all of a sudden every male in the United States had a shaved head, and it was like the whole country had collectively decided it was time for vengeance. And of course, for me, because I study history and I study politics, and I'm always doing this academic thing where I try to remove myself from the moment and then look at it from the outside, but also because I've lived in 6 countries and I speak 3 languages and I've traveled my whole life, I have this tendency to go, yeah, but wait, what about this situation? So 3,000 deaths sucks. It was a tragedy. This was not a good experience. Terrorism sucks in general. But I couldn't help but keep asking myself questions like, well, let's see, we lynched 5,000 Black people after Reconstruction was ended. You know, how many Native American children did we murder in the Native American schools, in the Indian schools? The Clinton administration starved to death 800,000 Iraqis, 500,000 of whom were age 5 and under. We literally murdered 500,000 Iraqi babies in the Clinton administration. Where's all the rage about those events? And of course, that's what nationalism does. It elevates the people that you think of as your nation to a status where it actually terminates the humanity of all the other people. So it becomes okay. It becomes okay that 800,000 Iraqis died. It becomes okay that 5,000 African Americans were lynched, because we those just aren't important. What's important is the 3,000 that died on 9/11, and we became OCD fixated on this thing as if it was the first time there had been a human tragedy. It was as if it was the first time anybody on the planet had ever suffered. And that myopic worldview is only possible through nationalism, through the lens of nationalism. The belief that you somehow think that you are so much better than everybody else, that everybody else's suffering is not important. Nationalism is when you believe that your nation is superior to all other nations, which means by definition, all other nations are inferior. And in fact, nationalism is predicated on the otherizing of other people, right? You go, we are this, which means they are not. They are the other thing, which is of course absurd once you've traveled, because you realize everybody is pretty much exactly the same. And so the stories that these people are telling touch on this whole idea of this otherizing, this constant setting you apart. No matter how much explaining you do, you will never be part of the collective that thinks you're part of the other. And then of course, one of the key features of all forms of nationalism is that they almost always, I'm saying almost always, I'm pretty sure it's always, but just to be careful, revolve around some act of violence. There is some single moment in history, a violent moment, that you just sort of rally the troops around, that you encircle and you say, this is that sacred moment that defines us. And I would have thought the Civil War would have been that sacred moment, because, right, the Civil War also ends this nasty institution of slavery that we've decided to cover up and no longer talk about. And instead, we've turned it into this bizarre moment where US foreign policy directly led to the moment. And then the result is the last 20 years have been a catastrophe for the United States. We have literally done everything wrong, everything. Our foreign policy has been awful. Our economic policy has been awful. Our domestic policy has been awful. We've let our infrastructure fall around our ears. And the result was Trump. The tragedy of 9/11 isn't just that we conduct these stupid wars like Afghanistan and Iraq and needlessly kill somewhere between 1.5 to 2.25 million people, who, by the way, weren't from countries that attacked us, right? Not a single one of the 19 hijackers was from Afghanistan or Iraq. But the craziness of the tragedy of 9/11 is that we've actually turned everything in on ourselves. We've wiped out the 4th and 5th Amendments and the First Amendment habeas corpus. And in the process, we elected Trump. And we end up with an insurrection. And so it's like layers of madness, 20 years of watching this terrible movie unfold and being powerless to stop it. And it's all because we refuse to reflect. And, you know, like maybe the only hope is that the people who lived through 9/11 pass away into the darkness and millennials and Gen Z take over, and a generation that isn't framed by this and aren't, you know, tainted by this take over. But I just can't wrap my mind around how bad this last 20 years has been. So to me, the real tragedy in 9/11 is the 20 years since. And I'll stop it on that note.
If no one else wants to comment on this, I think we might be ready to listen to the next two clips.
I just want to add one little thing, just building on what Habiba said about explaining. You know, a lot of times I was asked in the classroom and just generally by friends, exactly what was the moment when Islamophobia began, and exactly how did it happen? And I think Habiba put her finger on it. This expectation to explain, this being held accountable, not as an individual, but as a group, really sort of was the technology, the strategy, not a well thought out necessarily strategy. This is sort of a strategy that keeps repeating itself, right? It's almost become part of human nature, where we flip the power dynamic or insert a new power dynamic where somebody becomes subordinate and the other person becomes the dominant. And it starts with this type of questioning. When we allow ourselves to think, okay, I have that much power that I can stand in front of someone who themselves is a victim at this moment, because they're probably are also a citizen, and maybe even suffering more because of the misplaced shame that they're feeling. But I'm gonna assert myself. I'm gonna stand a little bit taller and make them shrink. And I'm going to ask them the question that no one should be asked. And that sets up a power dynamic. And as if white supremacy wasn't already doing that to Black and brown folks who are Muslim, this added a very public sort of dynamic that keeps, and it kept reproducing itself in all the public arenas, right? In film, in plays, in private conversations, in the classroom, like we heard. Yeah. I'm
done. Do we have more comments, or do we want to go on? Okay, I'm taking as we should go on. So I want to thank you everyone for your thoughtful comments and for also sharing your experiences with us. So the last two clips that we have here for you to hear will be about surveillance. I want to present Sehar Ezez. Sehar is a Pakistani American woman with experience organizing with marginalized communities. She grew up in Alabama, and in this clip, she speaks about the struggles her family and her community faced in the aftermath of 9/11.
I think there was just a lot of fear for us because we were new in that area. And, you know, we just got this business. It would have been very scary for us had people just started boycotting us, which I know a lot of people really never even in the 20 years we were in that town to that day never came to our business. And so there was just this kind of immediate need to fall back and blend in and not come up in front of customers as much to kind of mitigate that damage. And at that time, you know, no one really knew, there weren't those kinds of resources out there for our community to know how to respond to certain questions. You know, if people came in and said, or do you support this, that, or the third? They didn't really know how to respond to those questions. So their immediate reaction was to kind of fall back. And I know sometimes we have conversations where like we need to stand up for ourselves, we need to educate people, but I think we also have to remember that generation, especially first the immigrant generation, were very much fighting for survival. So I don't think we can fault them for fighting back and falling back and assimilating the way they did. I think not just in the South, but the family friends we had up north and elsewhere, you know, we knew people and heard of stories of people being interrogated by the FBI, being set up by the FBI. We had a few friends who had very traumatic experiences in that aspect. And, you know, we had witnessed FBI agents come into mosques and pretend to be converts. And, you know, it was a big struggle for those communities to retain their sense of community while dealing with that. And so those spaces, masjids, often became educational centers for people. They would, after any kind of incident, kind of use that time in the mosque to educate people, you know, this is who you contact for help. This is what you shouldn't do. This is what you should do. There were times where in certain communities, there would be people protesting outside masjids, armed. And on those days, the people in the community said, you know, women and children need to stay home. Kind of older people come to the masjid today instead. And that's kind of how I saw those communities adapt.
All right, so our last narrator today is Juan Coronado. Juan is an oral historian and professor of public history at Central Connecticut State University. He grew up in Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, just 10 miles away from the border. And in this clip, he discusses how things changed at the border after 9/11.
So on the border, the inspections just became a little bit more intense, right? Where, you know, to be honest with you, as a kid and growing up, you know, before 9/11, before a lot of this militarized mentality, you know, all you really had to say, the border agent would ask you, hey, are you an American citizen? And it was all answering, right? You'd answer, yeah, I'm an American citizen. And at that point, they may or may not ask for ID. There's plenty of times in my youth where they didn't even ask for ID. They just simply asked you, hey, are you a citizen? Yeah, we're a citizen. Okay, go ahead, cross. All right, that's how easy it was. That's how easy it was. And or maybe sometimes they didn't even ask you, you know, whether you're a citizen. Sometimes they'd ask you, hey, what are you bringing back? And that was it. That was the question you got at the border. Hey, what are you bringing back? Well, you know, I'm bringing back some tacos, or I got some medication, you know, whatever it was. You know, if you're bringing back liquor or cigarettes, hey, don't forget to pay the tax. And that's how simple it was back then. After 9/11, we were so paranoid of the next terrorist attack. And in South Texas, about 4 days after, there was a damage done to Queen Isabella Causeway that connects Port Isabel, Texas to South Padre Island, Texas. And a boat took out the causeway, causing significant damage in the middle of the night that, you know, damaged this highway, causing it to collapse. And in exchange, a couple of cars went off the highway in the middle of the night, and I want to say a couple of people died. But we were so paranoid that this was the next terrorist attack, and you know, it took a few days to figure out what was the root of this. It so happened to be that I want to say a boat that should not have been traveling through those waters ended up causing the damage, right? But we're so paranoid that, hey, this war on terrorism is in their backyard now, right? So I think it really, it had that impact on us where we were now living under fear. And of course, this had something to do with 9/11, but it also had to do with the nation's reaction to 9/11.
Now we're going to return to our panelists and allow them more space to speak before we enter the Q&A portion, in which you can submit your questions in the chat to be fielded. Thank you.
I'll jump in right after with an add to what Juan was saying, because I mean, I think this is a really important point that he makes. So I've been to Mexico without a passport, and I've walked into the United States from Mexico without a passport, and I've been to Canada without a passport, and I've come back in the United States without a passport. And that's obviously gone. And I remember when the announcement was made, and the thought that came through my mind was, wow, because of this event that, on the grand scheme of things, wasn't the worst tragedy in human history. We're going to roll back all the progress that we've made in our relationship with Mexico and Canada. NAFTA, people were thinking, was going to take us in the direction of the European Union. There was this hope that obviously it wasn't. And the reason I'm saying that is because the European Union decided from the beginning that if the capital was going to change borders, the people had to be able to change borders. And obviously that was not the case with NAFTA. We made very sure that Mexicans knew they were unwelcome here. But nonetheless, maybe over time through trade, we could end up in a place where we would be somewhat like the European Union. And that instantly ended that possibility. There was no going back. And that's exactly, I think, what happened on every level after 9/11. Let me give you an example of how it could have been different. Norway. There was a guy named Anders Behring Breivik who used to like to listen to Sean Hannity. He was Norwegian, and Sean Hannity had kept saying over and over again, Muslims are going to kill you. They're going to slit your throats in the night. They're going to teach your children Sharia law, and they're going to make the United States have Sharia law. So Anders Behring Breivik decided to do something to stop this from happening to poor Norway with its 2 million Norwegians. And so his response was to set off a bomb in Oslo and then jump on a boat, go out to an island where there was a youth camp and murder a bunch of children with an assault rifle. And he killed I don't remember the number, 80-something people, 80-something children. I think it was 90 people all told. Norway conducted this massive investigation, not just about how it got to the point where he did this, but how it was possible that he did it. Like, why wasn't the police tracking him? Should they have been watching his Facebook account? Like, how did he get this assault rifle? The boat to go to the island to stop the massacre, the police boat wasn't operative at the time. The police helicopter wasn't operative at the time. There were all these things that the Norwegian government had failed to do that could have mitigated the damage and made this less horrific. And Norway said, after they studied the report, the Norwegian government said, we don't want to end up like the United States. We're going to do absolutely nothing to correct. In other words, if our choice is more crazy Sean Hannity style terrorists or no rights in a police state that overreacts to everything with nationalism and violence, we're gonna accept that there's gonna be more terrorism. It's better. We would rather preserve our way of life. And the United States did the exact opposite. We blew everything up, including our own country's system of rights and rules. And that overreaction didn't have to happen. That was a leadership choice. If we had had a president with a 3-digit IQ, that might have made a difference in that moment. And that not just the president, but Congress. Like, John Kerry voted to take us to war. John Kerry, the guy who threw his medals into the White House grounds and made his career on his anti-Vietnam War stand, voted for this war. Like, forget Clinton. We don't even need to go that place. John Kerry did it. It was such an utter betrayal of everything he stood for. And of course, he tried to make up for it when he was Secretary of State, but it's too late. You can't resurrect the dead at that point. You can't undo the damage. John Kerry is going to have to live with that shame for all eternity. And he even tried to backpedal in the 2002 presidential election. I was for the war before I was against the war. Anyway, I'm gonna pass it on now.
Yeah, for me, what stood out in that last clip was, the talk that this was something that took place primarily at the border. The shift was something that happened primarily at the border. I think when I look back at the sort of rhetoric around 9/11 in the year after, and the sort of new legislation that came in, the erosion of civil liberties that happened in that time period, there was often this promise that this would only take place at or beyond the borders, that the surveillance would take place of people in foreign countries or those who are corresponding with people in foreign countries. Or that, the erosion of civil liberties that would happen will only take place for the people at the border, the Muslims who didn't exactly fully belong, right? So when we first had CVE style programs come to take place or whatever, they were targeting Muslim groups, particularly immigrant groups, particularly groups that were also at the border. And I think over the past 20 years, one thing we've seen is that this stuff doesn't stay isolated to those borders or beyond those borders. It comes home to roost. And so the militarism that happened in the past 20 years, the equipment that was used internationally, the techniques that were used internationally, the strategies that were used internationally in war zones, eventually came home to our police departments. Which is so strange and interesting to think about. The surveillance programs like CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, that came up to target and surveil Muslim communities, they had their origins in anti-Black programs like COINTELPRO earlier. In the same way that we think of these things as rather, opposing to each other entirely or in separate domains from each other. COINTELPRO is taking place for Black communities domestically, the CVE style program and other surveillance programs taking place for Muslims with international origin. They sort of merge and come together in the same way that militarism that was supposed to be appropriate and okay in these zones of wars internationally comes back home to Black communities here as well. And so I think one of the things we've learned over the past 20 years is how these things that were promised take place only at the extremes, only at the borders, only in these particular circumstances often expand. And I also want to, think about how the ways in which we remember 9/11, how that impacts this, right? The stories we tell ourselves about 9/11 have this very tangible impact on this community of Muslims, but also for all of us, in these spillover effects on our civil liberties, on the erosion of our public space, on the surveillance of our social media, speech, and communities, all of this. And to tell you a little bit more about the CVE style programs that have taken place, this is often seen as a sort of softer form of counterterrorism work. Started under President Obama in 2014. It was seen as a way to do counterterrorism without having as much violence, but we know that these programs are still violent, they're still harmful. They've targeted hospitals, mental health services as well, set up mental health providers, doctors, teachers or empowered them to surveil the folks that they provide services to or their peers as well. We know that with the creep of these programs, these surveillance programs into each of these institutions, Muslim people in particular, immigrants in particular, Black immigrants in particular, face barriers to accessing that safe care that they would otherwise get from schools, from hospitals, from these community services. And it also alienates Muslim folks from participation in political and civic life, which we heard in some of the interviews as well. A lot of young Muslims saying how they were told to be a little bit quieter, to assimilate a little bit better, to not participate as much as they could otherwise in public life.
To build on what Ramesh was saying, you probably all know that the Patriot Act was initiated the month after, right? It was in October. And by the way, USA Patriot Act USA doesn't stand for USA in USA Patriot Act. And that right away should have set off all sorts of alarm bells. But the bill was not written after 9/11. It was actually written after the federal Murrah building in Oklahoma City was bombed. So it was actually a Clinton administration law. And the idea behind it was the next time there was a terror attack, we would implement it and create sort of a total surveillance society where the Fourth and Fifth Amendments would effectively be eliminated. And that's the first paragraph of that bill said that Congress can't read any further, that the bill itself would be completely secret, so that that the legislative body voting for it wouldn't even know its contents. And then they passed it. They passed it in this completely frenzied moment. 96 senators voted for it. I think it was 410 representatives voted for it. So it passed overwhelmingly and went into effect. It was challenged, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that when it came to security, your rights did not matter, which is a baffling ruling, because then what's the point in even having a Bill of Rights? Like that's the one time you need a Bill of Rights, is when the state feels like it should trample them. And then they tried to pass the USA Patriot Act 2. It was so over the top, they couldn't get it through. So what they did was they chopped it up into pieces and then stuck it as riders to other bills. And we keep renewing this thing. The USA Patriot Act has been renewed every year since, until they decided they didn't need to renew it every year. They could renew it every 3 years. And I think now they're renewing it every 5 years. Why? The emergency is ended. Where are these terror attacks? The only terror attacks I keep seeing are teenage boys going into shopping malls and schools and shooting the place up. And so there's this really strange disconnect that we have this massive anti-terror infrastructure in place, but for what? Where are these terror attacks coming from? And then, as if that's not enough, in 2006, we passed the Military Commissions Act, which actually got rid of habeas corpus, which is the most important right. It was restored in 2009, but just the fact that Congress had to pass a law to restore habeas corpus shows how far we were willing to go in our freakout event. And so in a really crazy way, Osama bin Laden did something, and then the United States magnified it by 100-fold and then inflicted it back on itself.
Abiba, do you want to go next, or should I jump in?
Yeah, why don't you throw in some?
Okay.
You go in.
Yeah, so one of the things that I used to do in my classes, whether they were the critical race theory classes or the Islamic studies classes, was the very first day, the first thing I would do, I'd go in and I'd say, okay. And in the critical race theory classes, the topic that we studied was racialization of Muslims. And I would say, all right, I want you to close your eyes right now and imagine. I'm going to say a word and I want you to focus on what comes to mind. Like, you're going to imagine something. Remember, notice what the first image in your mind is going to be. And I would say Muslim. And then I would intentionally say the Muslim's wife. And of course, the majority would say, and I'd say, I want you to write that down on a paper. And the majority would come up with Osama. And then they would come up with, as they would, and when the honesty would like kick in and some of them would be honest, they would say a gaggle of wives. So all of this training in grade school post 9/11, and these were the students who had come up through grade school and middle school in post 9/11 world. This is what they would understand viscerally from the word Muslim, and then the Muslim's wife, because a Muslim can only mean a man, and a scary man with a beard, a terrorist. And I really found it interesting when in the last, the one right before the very last interview with Sehar Ezez, when she said, she said, we didn't have the language to fight back. We didn't have the language to make sense of all of this. And our immediate response, she said, was to fall back. Fall back on what she didn't make clear, but just to fall back. That was a really sort of visual thing for me. And then she said, what we need to understand is that the generation, especially the generation who were immigrants, she was probably talking maybe about her parents or grandparents, they were fighting for survival during 9/11 and immediately after and since. And then she used the word assimilation. And what comes to mind for me has always been in the process of the racialization of Muslims, the impetus, the push behind that behind that assimilation? What is it that makes us Muslims feel scared enough that we have to even sometimes emulate white folks in their language, which is what happened right after 9/11. We didn't have the language, a critical language of our own. And if we did, I just want to add this, even if we had, and some university professors did, and they got fired, even if we had the critical language to stand up and say, listen, y'all have been terrorizing this region of the world for decades. Don't come standing in front of me telling me this is my fault. First of all, I had nothing to do with it. And then let's talk about both sides of the story. Nobody could even think about saying anything about it. And the response was fall back, assimilate even further, go deeper into a lie. Get further away from authenticity, get further disconnected from our cultures, our understandings of the world that we were bringing with us, because we had lived through wars that were started by the United States, supported by the United States. We had to forget all of that and instead pretend. And that's what assimilation, especially in the last 20 years, has meant for me, pretending.
Can I extend something that what you're saying, to kind of extend that and to think about, you know, as somebody who was identified as you know, a Muslim American Muslim, because all I knew was the United States, you know, pre 9/11, where our political, in the pre 9/11 space, we were politicized in particular ways, in sort of being aware of sort of struggles around the world, right? Palestine, Iraq, Kashmir, and there was an awareness, and that a lot of times our political organizing centered around those issues. And I think to kind of connect to something that Banafsheh was saying, is that in the post 9/11 space, so much of the political organizing became about organizing around our belonging in some way, right? That we are Americans and affirming the Americanness. And so there was this kind of like bargains that we had to make in terms of choosing our politics, because, you know, in terms of even, for example, our charities and the works that we would fundraise for, because, you know, in Richardson, Texas was the Holy Land Foundation, which was sending money to Palestine. And that was that charity was shut down immediately after 9/11. And it was, they were the first people tried under terrorism charges post 9/11, and you have 5 people who were doing charitable works that continue to be in prison from the Dallas area, and you can find that out by just looking up the Holy Land 5. But they, you know, they were charged in this new post 9/11 landscape, but also kind of, you know, I mean, not to say that one should not be doing charitable works in the US, but there was also sort of an intentional shift in terms of what you can and cannot touch outside the borders of the United States. And so then there's sort of new divides in American Muslim political life, because to then engage in projects outside of the borders of the United States becomes a little bit more dangerous, as we saw. You know, a couple of things that I want to add to about sort of where we are now with education and schooling. You know, I think that I really liked Roy's point that he made earlier, like that 20 years later, we're in a place where a lot of these techniques that we've developed, whether it's through surveillance or other norms, we've turned on ourselves, right? And we are currently in a space where I think it's quite, you know, we understand our political landscape is extremely divided. And I think one of those manifestations of that division is the sort of hesitancy to talk about race, and the legislating against discussing race in schools through the new state law in Texas, the HB 3979 and HB 3, which are the critical race theory bills. And I want to say that one of the things that law centers around is around protecting children from discussions of race. What they really mean is protecting discussions for students from hearing discussions about whiteness, and protecting students from kind of assigning any responsibility to any problems in America to whiteness. And so, one of the laws states that in the school, the child cannot be made to feel bad because from the curriculum about his or her race. Well, I just want to add that, like, what we see in 9/11, in 9/11 curriculum, which is actually a requirement, if according to the state law, if school, I don't know what the state law is, maybe Tiffany, you know that state law. I don't have it off the top of my head, but there was a state law that says if 9/11 is on a school day, then the teacher has to teach it, right? So in that instance, on that day, you are teaching not just Muslims, but you're teaching everyone what Muslims, it's the first time that the notion of Islam and Muslims becomes introduced to children in the state of Texas. And so you are creating a picture of Muslims on that day. That teaches students about their own race in a bad way, and creates this knowledge around race. And so there's all of these contradictions that exist that I think are define this moment that we're in 20 years later, where we have sort of this war within the US, or conflicts within. But I think that kind of, if we think back to sort of the experience of schooling, this is where kids learn about Muslims. And I have my own children. Oh, it's HB 1501. Yeah, my own children will start asking me, their mom, questions about why are they talking about Muslims in this way? And moreover, as Muslims, their question is, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in this? Because we are Muslim, right? So it creates a lot of confusion, and it's just under the nationalist framework that curriculum currently exists, it's not enough. It has to be changed. So yeah.
I'd like to jump back in a little bit and talk about what Habiba said to a degree before she started talking about the curriculum. And it still builds on what I was saying earlier and Ramesh was saying earlier. The Republican Party in 1980 identified the #1 problem in the United States. So, like you think, oh, was it race? Was it violence against women? By 1980, I know this is going to sound crazy, but we already knew there was a thing called global warming. We've literally done nothing about it for 40 years, which actually should prove to millennials and Gen Z that your parents and grandparents hate you and don't care about you. We had a little bit of a debt. The economy was starting to come apart a little bit at the seams. That wasn't it. The thing that the Republican Party identified was a thing they called the Vietnam syndrome. And the Vietnam syndrome that was the term they were using, Vietnam syndrome. It was that the American public had turned against warfare, that the American public had decided after the humiliating rout that the Vietnam War was. And by the way, that's an objective term, right? This tiny itty bitty little state beat us, and they beat us badly to the point where we were shoving helicopters into the water as we were evacuating. That the United States public had turned against warfare. So one of the things that the Republican Party desperately was trying to do was show the American public war is fun. War can be good. War is a wonderful thing. All you got to do is, maybe we need to win one, because we literally hadn't won one since World War II. And so the Reagan administration actually began looking for a way to get us into a war that the Reagan administration knew they could win. And of course, the first war that they got us into was Israel had invaded Lebanon in 1982, and we decided to go help Israel. For those of you who don't know, Lebanon is itty bitty teeny weeny little state. Like Israel's bigger, and Israel's small to begin with. And so the next thing you know, Great Britain, France, the United States, and Israel gang up on Lebanon. And we got stung. We got stung really badly. A suicide bomber drove a truck full of explosives into the Marine Corps barracks and into the French military compound and killed hundreds of military personnel. And it didn't work. And then the next thing you know, we're doing the war in Panama. And Reagan, before the war in Panama, we're super obsessed with Gaddafi and Libya. And then, we're bombing Libya. And then we do the war in Panama. And then we do the first war in Iraq. And all of this was in part to try and get us used to war. And then 9/11 happened. And it was like manna from heaven. It was almost as if Osama bin Laden wanted the Republican Party to finally have its solution to get the American public back into enjoying warfare again. And we attack Afghanistan, a country that did not attack us, didn't have the means to attack us, and never attacked us. And then we turn around and attack Iraq, a country that never attacked us, never had the means to attack us. And the irony, of course, in both cases was they used to be our allies. They had recently been our allies. We had been working with both of those states, and we turn on, and by the way, Panama too. Manuel Noriega was a CIA operative. So like there was just layers of, oh, if you were friends with the United States, at some point they will turn on you and they will blow your country up. And of course now, here we are 20 years later, and we just got humiliated again in another unbelievably stinging rout. And so I don't know, is this a lesson that we just have to keep learning every 20 years? Is this something that we can't get through in our head? And one of the things that was sad about this for me was in the build up to the 2003 war against Iraq, I had a liberal friend and we got into a conversation and she said, the president wants to do this war, we need to back him. And I said, wait a minute, but the president could be wrong. And she goes, no, but this is what the president wants to do. We need to back him. We need to support him. And that was the attitude that the country had had in 2003. And when you compare that to the attitude the country had had in 1966, you can see that there had been this really radical, crazy shift to the right. And it was almost like collectively we'd lost our minds. We had forgotten that the government wasn't necessarily going to do the right thing for us, and that we as a public, it was our duty to stand up to the state and say no.
I want to jump in now and take some questions. And our first question, I think, is really relevant to what you were just talking about, Roy. Oops, I lost the chat. Sorry. Hang on. Oh, and our first question comes from Teni Wijaya, and she asked this question for the panel. What do you think of President Biden's message of unity? Should we strive for unity or harmony going forward? And I would add to that, what would that even look like? And so yeah, if anyone wants to respond to that.
Yeah, I think we hear a lot about in all the commemorations around 9/11 in the 20 years since, this romantic idea of how there was this crystal clear, perfect unity that was felt in the wake of 9/11. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, like, unity for whom? Unity with whom? Harmony with who? I don't think that Sea Command that Roy told us about earlier felt that unity or harmony on that day. I don't think that the Afghans, I don't think that the Iraqis felt that unity or that harmony. So it seemed that unity always needed that external enemy to organize itself against, someone to identify who we were unified against, someone to point out in order to be able to say, we are not that, we are this. And I think, yeah, Roy talked a little bit about this earlier as well. The Star Wars language that we used is what allowed us to be so unified, that we were using civilizational language around evil, terror. What else did we use? Yeah, things like this. It became a righteous, holy kind of struggle. And I think that's sort of what we got with that unity. So I want to trouble that a little bit. What kind of unity are we talking about? Who's counted in that unity? And so, yeah, the other, often, I think, from the stories that we've heard, both in this, in the oral archive, the stories that we're hearing today as well, tell us that I think that other that we painted on that day that we unified against may have been the Muslim-looking people in the room that we identified, or the Muslim-looking people abroad that we identified. And then unity also is a kind of dissent, right? there was not that unity in the Vietnam War, where there were active protest movements, anti-war movements as well. So when we have unity, when we build a harmony, are we also silencing any kind of dissent? Are we silencing any kind of discussion? What's the conversation that's being had that we then sort of bring unity into the room for?
I want to add to that a little bit. I think it's a really good question. Because I do think that unity sounds good, and I'm not opposed to unity, I'm all in support of good unity, right? It's like, what is that unity that we're going for? I want good unity. I want a unity that's inclusive of the good things, however I define them. And I just want to take us back because, it is the 20th anniversary, and I've been going back in my head 20 years ago, while I can still remember things. And I was telling the kids, and I was talking to the kids about how in that moment of, sort of the craziness of those days, that, the first press conference by Rudy Giuliani, where he was at the helm, right? He said, I don't have the quote, but he basically was, standing there with a bunch of people, police officers, other folks behind him. And he said, we're all struggling as New Yorkers. We need to be together. And something that he said was, be there for each other, support each other. And he said, your neighbors did not do this. This was Rudy Giuliani. And I'll tell you that when I heard that, I said, thank you to the screen. Thank you, Rudy Giuliani, who said that at that moment, right? There was, again, what 9/11 turned out to be is something that we can't necessarily predict. We didn't know at that moment, but at that moment, there was a desire for unity. And as a Muslim person from a Muslim community living in New York City, I wanted to hear that, and I wanted that unity, but a certain type of unity that was not necessarily this, the unity that the people, who's that oral history, the Afghani girl, her name, that unity was not inclusive of her and her family, right? And here I am saying, after all we know and all the craziness about Giuliani, they didn't hear their mayor's message at that time. They were throwing eggs at her, right? So I think that I like unity. I want there to be unity. I want there to be unity around dealing with the pandemic, But we also know that there's a lot of dissent around the pandemic, and I'm very skeptical of that dissent around the pandemic, right? So I think it's a good question, and I think that we need to kind of think about, well, what is that? We constantly need to think about what is the idealized vision of unity, because I do think that there's something, Negena Haidary, I think that there's something that we do aspire towards, a unity that we can be a part of, and so there's this constant question about, what are those boundaries of that unity? And when we feel good around that boundary, around unity, or how are we remaking those boundaries of unity?
I saw a tweet today, or no, I saw it yesterday, that I keep coming back to, and it used this phrase, weaponized grief, talking about how our grief has been weaponized, which I felt like, really just gave words to something that I have been feeling. And I think, again, points to some of what you're saying with talking about like a more positive, inclusive kind of unity, that unity has been weaponized, right? It's been used in the service of a particular kind of agenda. And, that's not a unity that's actually unifying.
Yeah, if I can jump in for a second, just building on what Habiba said and what you just said, Tiffany. When I hear, I love unity, like, who doesn't? But especially 20 years later, what we are now seeing is Muslims organized. We see Muslims pushing back in a big way. And they're not just organizing for Muslims. They see the treatment of Muslims in the United States, especially in the last 20 years, as a continuation of white supremacist belief and policy that's been around for centuries. And we are now connecting our stories with the stories of other Black and brown folks. And now, under these conditions, these sort of liberatory, this wave of liberation movement, new wave of liberation movements, when somebody says, when white man in power says unity, I just get bristly. I'm like, yikes. Like, we were okay while we were silent and feeling guilty when we shouldn't have been, and playing apologetic and just shrinking and putting our heads down. But now that we have a voice and we're connecting our voices with those of other, let's just say, Black folks who've been fighting for generations, let's just say. Now we're supposed to be silent again. Unity, an invitation to unity includes, if not silence, toning down. I want to invite folks who invite me to unity to listen and just sit back and listen a little bit, to fall back a little bit. Since they're in positions of power, they can fall back a little bit.
I'm with Benefsha on the, I cringe when I hear white men say unity. What I hear is my country, right or wrong. I hear love it or leave it. I hear God bless our troops, especially our snipers. And I gotta say, it doesn't really make me feel warm and fuzzy inside. What I hear is shut up, get in line, obey. In the same way, that you would expect the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China to speak. What I would like to see is unity of dissent. So I have, been to a lot of protests in my life. And what I would like to see is for the people who went to the pro-gay marriage protests that I've been to, or the pro-workers' rights, or the pro-immigrants' rights protests, or the pro-civil rights protests. Those people also need to show up at the anti-war protests, and they need to show up at the anti-massacre protests, because I'm at your protests too. And we need to be like that. We need to be where we don't see those boundaries anymore. We don't go, well, this is my issue and I don't care about your issue, because your issue is my issue, because these are all connected together. And to see it any other way is to be divided and conquered. And you will always remain conquered. So yeah, I love the idea. Unity of dissent. Let's go for it.
We'll make the shirts.
We'll order some, Tiffany.
Well, I see we were going to bring this to a close at 3:30, so we have just a few minutes. Anyone have any final thoughts that you want to share as we wrap up?
I'll say one small thing, and that is, don't let people turn your grief into anger. Stay in the grief. Something makes you sad, be sad. Don't let it get converted. It's unhealthy.
I also want to say one more thing. One more thing is I asked some sister organizations to post this and push it on their social media. And there was quite a bit of pushback. There was fear. There was fear that, board members, administrators, and so they didn't. And I'm with them. I don't think they should blow their organizations up. But this still tells me that, first of all, thank you, Tiffany, for doing this. You are gold. And the second is we are very far from where we need to be holding these sorts of conversations. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm likewise reflecting on the power of our memory, on the power of our storytelling to shape the ways in which we act into history, right? So rather than having this collective amnesia around 9/11 and the events that happened after 9/11, I'm really energized and excited that IDCL, that I-AMM are coming together to record a different kind of history, to make sure that's out there, and then to mobilize that history as well, to institutionalize that history, mobilize that history into action. So I'm so excited to see that happening.
And I just want to add as well that that our oral history project is still an ongoing project. We'll be working on this over at least the next year. If anyone would like to be interviewed for the project, or if you know someone that you think has a story to tell that would be important part of this project, please do reach out to us, and we would love to talk to you. You know, at IDCL, part of our mission is, or one of the kind of catchphrases that we use to think about our work is that we want to tell all stories, that we know that there are a lot of stories that aren't told, that they're very intentionally suppressed. And so this is an initiative to elevate those stories, think about who's being left out, and you know, build some new narratives. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we also hope that we'll be able to share part 2 in another year where we can share more of these stories as well.
Tiffany, may I just explain what Interconnecting Arabs, Muslims, and Middle Easterners does, and invite folks to go to our website? So we've been around for 2.5 years, and this is basically a liberatory space for Arabs, Muslims, and Middle Easterners, regardless of religion. Regardless of religion. I think my sons are breaking down the door. Yes, it is 3:30, it's time. Regardless of religion, if you're Jewish and have ancestry from the region, if you're a non-believer and you have ancestry from the region, please come check us out. I'm gonna put the website here.
Also, regardless of ethnicity too. So.
Regardless of ethnicity, absolutely. If you're, there's a section over there under who is AM, Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern. This is a academic term that's it's the most inclusive that is out there. So if you are a Black revert, if you are a white convert, whatever you are, yeah, and we take part in education. We do educational programs. We have a podcast. Please go check the podcast out. It's all on the website. Yeah, just go check us out. And shoot me an email. Shoot me an email if you want to be a part of it.
Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And thanks to all of our panelists for sharing all of your thoughts and insights. And I want to thank all of those that we interviewed. I'm not sure if anyone that we interviewed as part of our oral history collection, any of the narrators are with us today, but I feel like I need to thank them as well, because their perspectives were also so important, and I'm so grateful for them. So thank you, everyone.